As I mentioned before, we want to be able to validate the information that's submitted on a form before we send it to the server. This saves us the trouble of having to validate every single obviously wrong piece of data on the server. We can catch it client-side first. Client-side validation is always done by the browser using JavaScript. These days, it's a lot easier because HTML5 has some built-in predefined ways to validate form input, which we will be taking advantage of. Now, you can't rely on this. You do still have to do server-side validation as well, because people can still circumvent things that are done in the browser. They can even just have JavaScript turned off and submit things that you would still have to intervene in that on the server side. We'll get into that in Unit 3. But for now, let's take a look at how we can do validation on the client side. So, what does this really mean? We're basically going to want to go through all the input that's provided and check it. HTML5 provides ways to do this with a couple of different features. It's able to automatically look at the input that's been provided based on the type that you specify for the input. So for example, if you say number, it will make sure it's a number, and it will tell you if it's not. It doesn't prevent them from entering characters like letters, but it will at the very least tell you when they give you something that's not a valid number. It will also make sure that that number is within a certain range. There's simple JavaScript functions that you can call to check whether it thinks the input is valid or not. And you then also have the ability to provide your own custom validation steps if you'd like to. The last thing the browser typically does is it will ensure the entire form is valid before it allows it to be submitted. So your browser pays attention if you use these HTML5 input tags. It will refuse to allow the form to be submitted, and some of them, including Chrome, will highlight incorrect fields and give you a little message to tell you what it thinks is wrong about it. We'll be able to tap into all of those things and hopefully get some very robust validation happening here as we do this. With that in place, here's how we actually enable all of this. The first most basic thing you can do is you can mark an input as, quote, required. So you can see over here, if I have an input that's typed text, that basically means it'll accept anything. And if we mark it as required, that basically means that it won't let you submit an empty field. You can't leave it empty. You've got to put something there. Other ones that we can do, you can use a specific type, and email is one that commonly works really well on every browser. So if you mark it as email, then it will make sure what they've given you is a plausible email address. Now, this varies from browser to browser, exactly how strict they are about this. It turns out identifying valid email addresses is something that's actually really complicated. And they decide to err on the side of being generous. And so as long as it fits the pattern, something at something, it pretty much says that's an email address. It doesn't know if it's one that actually exists and works. It simply knows it fits the pattern of an email address. When you do numbers, you can use min and max values to constrict the range. So simply marking it with the type number means that it cannot be nan. You remember, not a number. So the function is nan, given the value, must evaluate to false. It needs to actually be a number. Notice there's a typo there. That should be a capital N-A-N. The A is lowercase, but the N's are capital. Now, it will also then check that the number is between the range of min and max. Now, min and max are optional. If you don't want a max, just leave it out, and then it won't check against a max. If you don't want a min, leave that out, and it won't check against a min. So you've got the value range that you can deal with here. Now, with all of that being said, we are going to combine this with everything that we just saw about Bootstrap. So Bootstrap is going to give us all these special things like form groups and all the different features that allow us to show feedback in them. And it also lets us make all of this style much more robust. We're going to take advantage of that too. So when we check something and find out that it's not valid, we can use Bootstrap to highlight it in red or to supply that glyph icon that makes things look bad. All of that, or rather, that I should say makes things look bad, lets the user know there's an error. So let's go ahead and do all that. We're going to switch to a slightly more sophisticated form. Remember, this was the example we looked at before. I already have a form set up that has a little more detail in it that we're going to work with. So take a look around these lecture examples. This starting code should be in there for you. And the purpose of it is basically to create a new forum post is kind of what we're emulating here. So let's take a tour around here real quick and make sure that you understand what's going on with the code. Now, if you didn't watch the previous video, which is optional, you might be a little bit confused about how the styling is working now. Basically, in our project, we're now able to use Sass, and you'll find that there is a sassstyle.scss file out here. And this is using Sass to just sort of clean up the CSS a little bit, make it a little bit more reusable. So make sure, if you didn't watch the previous video, that you at least understand this is where we're going to edit the CSS now. And the amount of it that is SCSS is fairly minimal, so even if you aren't comfortable with that, you should still be able to understand what's going on here. And so this is going to be compiled down to another file that's inside of public. So that one's inside of SCSS. Inside public, we have sassstyle.css, and this is the compiled version of that. Again, I'll provide all this for you, and as long as you're using the latest version of the base project, it will just automatically grab this stuff and make it work. So here we have our basic form setup. With each of these, I'm doing exactly what was done in the previous one. They all have a screen reader only label. They have their placeholder, name and ID set, as well as the classes form control, and then optionally the touch below and touch above that we created. So you'll notice the email and the confirm email touch one another, subject and tags touch one another, and then we had post body sitting on its own. And this was the one where I called it in this one, instead of touch both, I called it stand alone as that particular class, which spaces it out to be all on its own. And you can see what that looks like here. We have touch below, touch above, touch both, and then somewhere we should have stand alone. Oh, we don't. We should go ahead and make that. Let's go ahead and write standalone. It's a pretty simple one to create. So whenever we have one that we want to stand alone, we basically want to set it up so that it has a margin bottom of 10 pixels, but that we don't change the left or right radius at all. So that's what standalone will be. It was basically already doing that, so this doesn't have a significant change to what we get here, but we might as well make it so that it is actually in there. Make sure, too, that you're including sassstyle.css. I already did that here, instead of index.css, because that's the one we actually want to include and read. So, with all of this in place, let's see what we can do about creating validation. Now, in these, I have all the controls wrapped in a form group, and they have a class form control feedback sitting there waiting for us to put things in it. But for now, it's just form control feedback. It doesn't have any sort of glyph icon in it yet. I've done that to everything. I also did it to the text area, but we're not really going to validate the text area. I only did that so that we could apply the label in the typical way that it wants, and so it will get spaced the same as everywhere else. We're not going to provide any feedback on the text area. Now, what do I want to do here? I want to go through and set these things up for validation first, and we're going to do that using all those things we saw just a moment ago. So when we're inside here, we need to mark some things as required, make sure we're using the proper types, use numbers if we feel so compelled, and set all these things up. So let's go ahead and do that. The first thing we want to do, I want to make sure that the first 4 things are all required. So I'm going to come to the actual input tag for the email and just say required. Same thing down here for the confirmation email. I want them to enter both, and I want to make sure they match. That's what that's supposed to be. Then here for the subject, we're going to make that required. It can't be blank. For the tags, that I'm okay with being blank, so I'm not going to mark that as required. And in fact, I think we'll find for the tags, there's really no reason to ever consider them invalid unless we were to find that they didn't match up in some way. But we could get more sophisticated with that. Maybe we'll play with it, but it's not going to be required. We'll accept a blank value there. And for the post body, I think this is one that we can go ahead and let that be empty as well. We're going to let it stand and just see if that's okay. I don't think it should cause any issues. So we've marked several things as required. The other thing we can do is use types like email or number and get some good validation on those. I'm already using a couple that have the type email. You can see here, the first one's set type to email, second one's set type to email. So it will flag those if they don't fit the email format as well, which is a good thing. Now, the subject, well, that's just always going to be text, so we can't really use a special type there. And the tags would just be like a comma-separated list. We could get more sophisticated with that if we wanted to, but for now, we're not going to. We'll just leave it as it is. All right. So with all that in place, we're ready to start validating the form, but we need to actually do that over on the JavaScript side. So I've got an index.js. I'm including that down here at the bottom of the script. Let's go ahead and start putting some things in here that will validate these fields. Now, one thing that we can do with jQuery that's really useful is we can write a chunk of code and make certain that that chunk of code will only get executed once the DOM is ready, once all of the components have been loaded, and we can be sure it's all ready to be accessed. We did have something like that before. If you remember, we could go up to the body tag and add a parameter on load and then set that equal to a function. But jQuery lets us do even better than that. Here's what it looks like. We say, again, the jQuery function, and then we say document.ready. And so notice here we're passing the DOM to it, the actual document object model, and then we're saying when it's ready, and here we would then give it a function. And this function is an event handler. All event handlers can accept an event object if we want it to, but we're not going to use that. When it's ready, and that's all we really need to know. Anytime you're writing global code in JavaScript in the browser, you should put it inside of the document ready block. This is important. If you were to put it outside that, you could cause really strange errors that only happen sometimes, or maybe only happen on certain browsers or certain really old, slow computers. Situations can arise where you're trying to access parts of the DOM and they're not there yet. So it's always important when you can to put it in this block. Of course, this assumes you're using jQuery, but these days, I really recommend you should always link in jQuery and make it available to you. It will make your JavaScript better. And this is just one example of that. The other thing that's nice is jQuery makes sure this works. It's a little different how you achieve this on every browser, especially when you get back into older browsers. jQuery has already normalized for that. Remember, we talked about one of its features is that it behaves consistently across all browsers. It normalizes. So I just write one function and jQuery takes care of the rest, and that's really valuable. All right, so here's where we'll put some of our global code. What do we want to do? We want to make sure that a particular field is valid or not. This is something that we have to check at a certain point in time, a certain point when things have changed or when they've typed in input into the particular field. So I have to basically respond to an event. If I were to just check it right at the beginning, well, they'd all be empty, they'd all be invalid. That isn't quite what we want. We want to wait until the user has actually put something in there. And then we want to check just that one thing they've put in. The event we can use for this, there's actually several different ones. We could use on change, and that's something that will fire whenever a new value has appeared inside of it. We could use functions that are something to the effect of whenever they leave. So remember, when you first come into a field, we call that focus. And then when we tab past it, we call that blur. Those are two very important events that happen a lot. I want to use the blur event. So whenever something loses focus, we'll assume that you meant to type something in there. This way, even if you just forgot and tabbed past it real quick, it'll still get highlighted, even though the value inside it has not necessarily changed. This, to me, is one of the most obvious events to key off of. So let's do that. Let's go through and select fields. I basically want to select every single form control, all of these. And I want to set up their blur function. And this is going to be an event that we pass a function to. And that function will receive an event object. So this is how jQuery handles events. You'll remember before, if we were doing this in a more JavaScript kind of way, we would have gotten the object first. We would have gotten just one control, so maybe like the email control. And we would have said document.getElement by ID. And then we would have said some sort of ID like email, I believe is the ID of the first one. We would have then said email control dot onBlur equals, and then we would have written a function for that one. that one single object. And then we would have needed to have gone through and done it to the next form control. Here, we're grabbing all the form controls at once. And we're going to go through and set up their blur functions for every single one of them all at once. This is the sort of time-saving power of jQuery here. So it allows us to get all of this done in a single fail swoop. So what do I want it to do? Well, I want it to go through and check the specific event that occurred on the specific input. In order to figure out which input it was that triggered this event, we're going to need to do something. I was missing a semicolon there. We're going to need to go into the event object and actually take a look at it. So let's do console.info event. This way we can examine that event and see what's really available there. So when the document's ready, we're going to set this blur event handler on every single form control. For now, it's not doing anything other than logging the results. And because we're doing that, let's go ahead and bring up the console so that we can keep an eye on that and see what it says. So when I click into it, it gains focus. And then if I were to tab out of it into another one, it blurs, it loses focus. And there it happened. That event gets fired. So let's take a look at this. This is a jQuery event object, which is very similar to a standard event object. And it's going to have a lot of things in it that we could key off of. Now, I know exactly what I'm looking for here, and I'll point you right to it. It's target. Target is the actual input that generated this event. So the first time here, it's email. Let's say we go into subject. We tab out of subject. You can see target now is post subject, or current target, delegate target. But the one that we really want is just plain old target. That's the most consistent one. It's subject. So this is the key thing that allows us to know which control generated this event, because that's something we got to think about. We're setting all of these event handlers at once. We're putting it on all the form controls at once. So we're going to have to use event.target to know which one it was that generated it. So event.target. Now, we would then, this particular one is going to be the standard JavaScript one. We're going to want to wrap it with the jQuery function so that it becomes the jQuery object. Because we're going to want to do a lot to it, and as is usually the case, jQuery is going to make that a lot easier. What do we want to do? Well, we want to validate it. So we would want to say if event.target and we'd want to validate it. Now we have some options here. Let's take a look. We can go in here. I'm going to go to the target itself. And if you go down past all of the on events, there's a lot of things in these, all the way down to this, you're going to see there's a validity function here. And you can say if .target.validity.valid to check if it is valid. That would be one way to get to it. And you can see here that it is in fact false. It is not valid. And why is that? Well, let's see. Are any of these marked as true here? The last one, value missing, is true. So this is all the different ways it can check validity. And the value is missing, is telling us. So that's what makes it invalid. Now that's all kind of vague. Let's look at something that's a little more concrete here that will tell us how to check this. So W3 Schools Forms API is where I'm going to go. And this is a link that talks about JavaScript form validation. So what we have here now also is a function that's provided on the JavaScript object only called .checkValidity. And that basically goes in and sees if anything is invalid. So we can say if event.target.checkValidity, and we basically want to say if not event.target.checkValidity, aka if it is invalid, then we'd want to do something. For now, let's just do a little alert. We'll say window.alert, and then we'll build a little thing here. We'll say event.target .name, because we gave them a name, right? Or actually the one that's good is placeholder. That's the thing that always looks right, is invalid. And so that'll basically tell us when we leave that function, it'll show a little alert that tells us it's invalid. So let's give that a try. close this out for now. We come in here. When I leave it, it says email address is invalid. Now it also triggers confirm email is invalid because it lost focus as soon as this alert came up. And we're going to get stuck in a loop here, aren't we? Yeah, because it's gaining and losing focus every single time we do this. So using a window alert here is not a good idea. We've just sort of proven. But you get that's the basic process, what's going on here. It shows that we can actually respond to this. So let's get that window alert out of here. We can do console.info instead and avoid this problem. Okay, so now it will be telling us they're invalid, but it'll be doing it in a less obtrusive way. It'll be doing it on the console where we can deal with it. So email address is invalid, confirm email is invalid, subject, and does it when we leave them. Now tags and post body don't care, but subject, confirm, and email address all do care. So there we go. Now, we'd actually like to communicate this to the user in as flexible a way as possible. And this is where all the Bootstrap features start to come into place. So ultimately, we've got them set inside form groups, and each one has a form control feedback if it's one that we're going to want to show feedback in. Let's see what we can do to actually make that feedback show up only when it's invalid. So if we come over here, we can see that when we check validity, we have an opportunity here to let it know that it's invalid. So if it is invalid, we could do the following. We could run a little function, and that function could do something to the effect of mark it, show the feedback. So let's say show error feedback. Let's call it that. And we're going to pass event.target into that. And now we'll need to write that function. So we'll say function show error feedback, and then we'll have the actual input right here. That's the input control receiving, which is event.target. Keep in mind here too, we're going to need to wrap this in a jQuery thing. And I think I'm going to go ahead and do that because I want to make sure that what we're receiving down here is jQuery. Now, we need to do a few things. Let's take a look at the DOM and the way this is set up. And we want to think about parent versus child. This is the actual input tag. It is a child of the div form group, and it has a sibling form control feedback. Those are the two things we need to get to. We need to get to the form group, and we need to get to form control feedback. Turns out there's some really easy ways to do this. First of all, we can say input.parent to get to its parent. That's all there is to it. And this will be the group tag, we'll call it. And that should allow us to pull out the parent of this particular tag. Then we can say add class and give it the class has error. And so let's go ahead and save that. If we click into here and move out of it, there it is. It has now received that feedback that shows it has an error in it. That's a big deal. So this gives us the ability to mark something as having an error. Let's go a little bit further. From this group tag, we should be able to find the proper child. We can say, we'll call this the feedback tag. This is the one that's actually going to show the icon. And this is going to be group tag.find. We talked about this when we were learning about jQuery. This is a function we can run where we can, again, pass it anything we want in terms of something to search for among the children. And so we can search for form control feedback. And then we'll want to go into that feedback tag and add the class. And the class we want to add is glyph icon and glyph icon remove. Those are the two that give it that sort of remove thing. Let's spell it right, feedback tag. And now, in addition to has error, we need to set it as has feedback as well. So we're going to grab the parent tag so that we've got the group, and we're going to grab the sibling over here. So we go from the parent, the group tag, look through its children for the one that has the class form control feedback. Now, if it happened to have a child that had more than one of those, we'd get all of them, but we know we've set it up to only have one. And it would be, you really wouldn't have more than one form control feedback on any given input. So this should work in all cases. Now, when we leave it, oh, we just ran into a problem here. Misspelled. Capital C. Let's hope that's all it was. Let's try again. There we go. And now our little red X is appearing as well as we leave each one. So we're immediately giving them that feedback, right? There's just one problem. If I were to come up in here and fix it, let's put in a proper name, well, it doesn't remove that feedback. So we also need to clear it after it's done. So we would say event if it's not valid, we show error feedback. Else, if it is valid, we want to show valid or show success feedback. Let's do that. And again, we're going to pass in the event target here. And I'm using functions liberally here. You wouldn't have to use functions to do all of this, but honestly, it helps. It makes life better. So once again, we're going to have to grab the group tag and the feedback tag, because that's where we're going to put the feedback. And then here, we want to add the class has success and has feedback. And then glyph icon check is what we're going to want, a little check mark that shows up. So if we go through and we type in a valid email, let's just do seth@test.com. It still does not like it. Oh, because I gave it the same name. What was I thinking there? This is the little copy pasta mistake there. Show success feedback. Okay, that should be better. So seth@test.com. There we go. It gets a little check mark and it shows green so that we know that it's good. Now, what if I were to come back here and mess this up? Let's change it back to Seth. Notice the glyph icon doesn't get corrected. Ultimately, what's going on here is after we add these classes, they're going to stay there until we forcibly remove them in some way. So we have to be a little bit careful. Before we go to add has success, let's just assume we don't know what classes it has. No matter what state it's coming from, we want to make sure that we take out any other possible states. So we would want to say group tag dot remove class, and we want to remove the class has error, because it doesn't have an error anymore. Now, we might be removing a class that's not there, but that's okay. That isn't going to cause any problems. We also need to do that to the feedback tag. We're going to want to go feedback tag dot remove class, and the glyph icon remove is the one that we'd want to get rid of. Again, it might not have that one, but it doesn't hurt to remove one that isn't there. So that way we're just covering our bases and we're making sure it doesn't happen. We need to do that also for show error feedback. We would want to remove the has success state. That's the only other possible one that could be there that would conflict. And then glyph icon check, so that if they did go back and mess it up, we'd take the success ones away before we add our error ones. Now, we don't need to remove the has feedback or glyph icon ones because those would stay there anyways. We would just add them right back in, so we might as well just leave them there. It also doesn't hurt to add a class that's already there. That has no ill effect. So let's save all this and let's try again and see if things work a little bit better. So Seth@test.com, that's good. Blah, that's bad. Let's come change again. Seth@test.com, that's good. And then let's break one. Let's go back and get rid of all this. Oh, and it cleared it back to being bad again. Perfect. So this allows us to acknowledge all of that feedback. So hopefully that all makes sense. This is now, all we're really doing is checking the validity from whatever it was that the automatic HTML5 tells us. Now we're going to find that when we go to actually submit the form, things are going to start to behave a little bit strange. It's going to mark a lot of things as successful that aren't. It's going to put a check mark over here instead of an X, and exactly why that is a little bit confusing. What we really need to be able to do here is take control of this and leave out some things that we don't want it to go through and do on submission. So how do we do that? Well, we're going to have to take control of the submit event. So let's get our form here. We're going to have hashtag new forum post, which is a form, excuse me, F-O-R-M. So that's our form tag, new forum post. And we're going to want to adjust the submit function. And basically, I'm going to write this as a separate function anyway. So I'm going to give it check form as the function that we want to run whenever this happens. And so we'll go down and write that function now. So we'll say function check form, and we're going to receive as this the event which comes in to this. This probably won't use it, but we'll put it there anyways until we're sure we don't need it. Now what do I want to do here? Well, the first thing I want to do, and this might seem a little counterintuitive, is I want to stop it from doing the default behavior. The default behavior is to go ahead and check all the forms and actually then submit them. So to do that, I say event.prevent default. And it's a function because of JavaScript, or excuse me, jQuery. So I say event.prevent default, and then this will keep it from trying to actually do what it would normally do. And so now when I click this, we're still getting the behavior where it goes through and tries to validate everything. Let's put something in for all of these. And now when I submit the post, if everything is filled in correctly, it isn't going to complain at all. But it still doesn't submit the form, which is a good thing, because that makes debugging difficult, and we also want to take control of that and submit it manually ourselves. Now the next thing we'd want to do, well, we want to figure out if the form itself is valid, if all of its things actually pass. Well, to do that, we kind of need to go through all of its children and check their validity, check if they are actually correct or not. This is going to require some sort of function that can generically check any particular input. For now, we just have a blur event that we're using, but let's see if we can make this more generic. Let's say we do a function check input error that receives an input. And it's going to look a lot like our blur function. So I'm pulling this out and kind of turning it into its own function now. And instead of event.target, we're going to use input to do this. So input.checkValidity, input, and input. And we don't actually, these inputs don't need to be wrapped in jQuery because we'll make sure they're already jQueryified, right? The other thing we'd want to do here is we want to make sure that jQuery supports this right here. Let's go take a look at our jQuery website and see what it supports for this type of form validity checking. See if it has any sort of valid function. So here's the full API. Let's get down to near the V's here. As TUV. Now val is to get the value out of an input. We don't need that. It doesn't look like we have validity or valid. Submit is to bind an event to the submit event for a form. Yeah. So we're going to have to use the original input right here to do that. So let's assume then that we've been passed in event.target instead, and we'll use that. An event.target would need to be wrapped with jQuery here. So we'll call this DOM input, just to make it clear that this is coming straight out of the DOM and is not necessarily a jQuery object yet. So check input error. We can then set this right on here. All it will do is just call check input error for event.target. So it simplifies this function a little bit, and that's a good thing. Plus we can share the logic that's in here between this and all of the other ones that we're going to need to check when we want to make sure that the form itself is valid. So why did we do this again? So we want to be able to call this manually when we're checking the final form and go through and check all of the inputs to make sure they're valid. So to do this, we're going to come in here with our form and we're going to say basically we want to find every single input tag that is, well, basically every single form control that's a child of our form. Well, we can do that. We can come in here and say hashtag new form post, and then I want every child of that is a form control. So this is a selector. This is going to select all form controlled children of new form post, which is guaranteed to be our form. And then we want to do something for each of those. You guys remember the for each function that we can use with arrays? Well, there's something similar to that for jQuery. It's .each. And this will go through and do something for each item in there. Let's take a look at that. This should be over here. A, B, C, D, E. Where are you? E, each. So this iterates over a jQuery object and pulls out each of its items. It takes the index first and the actual item second. Be careful there. That's backwards from how it normally is when you do a for each function. So we'll have I, and then we'll have the particular element itself. And now from here, we can go ahead and test the validity of that element. So we can say here, check input error of element. Now what we want to do, so the each here, it actually needs to be passed a function like this. Let's get our syntax correct. So we define that usual arrow function, and then we close out. This is the closing parentheses around the each parameter. We close out each like that. So it's going to go in, it's going to check them for error, if I spell it right, and it's going to basically then, it'll label them appropriately, but we want to do more than that. We want to know if it was correct or not. So let's change checkbook error a little, or check input error here a little bit. Let's have it return false when it's not valid, and return true when it is. So that gives us an opportunity to do something with that information. We then need to sort of collect this information. Let's create a variable, form is valid, and let's assume it is. Let's default to true. And then as we come through here, if any one of these is not valid, if not, check input error. Let's give that a better name, actually. Let's say, instead of check input error, we'll say is input valid. That's a name that fits what it does a little bit better. So is input valid, is input valid. Change that everywhere. So if it is not valid, then we want to acknowledge that. And we want to set form is valid to false. So then we have the opportunity to do something about the fact that our form is invalid and respond to it in some way.